Her name was Laura, and everyone around her described her with the same words: reliable, calm, unbreakable. She was the person people called in emergencies, the one who stayed composed when others panicked, the one who never asked for help. For years, Laura believed that being strong meant being silent. She learned early that emotions made situations complicated, and complicated things made people uncomfortable. So she became easy. She listened more than she spoke, fixed problems without explaining how tired she was, smiled in moments that deserved honesty instead. The strange thing was that no one forced her into this role. She volunteered for it because it felt safer than being vulnerable. Over time, her identity fused with usefulness. She no longer knew how to exist without being needed. The moment that changed everything was small and private. Sitting alone one night, she realized she couldn't remember the last time someone asked how she was and waited for a real answer. The question had become a formality, a social reflex, and she had perfected the art of responding without revealing anything. Aging didn't scare her. Emotional invisibility did. She understood that people saw her strength, but not her exhaustion. They admired her stability, but never asked what it cost. And Laura realized something painful and honest. Being the strongest person in the room often means being the loneliest one. Laura didn't become strong overnight. It happened slowly, in small decisions that seemed harmless at the time. She learned to suppress disappointment before it became visible, to turn anger into silence, sadness into productivity. Each time she chose not to speak, not to complain, not to ask for help, people praised her maturity. And with every compliment, she moved further away from her real self. She noticed how easily people leaned on her stability, how rarely they questioned it. The more dependable she became, the less human she was allowed to be. There were days when she felt emotionally transparent, as if everyone could see through her, but no one could see her. She carried other people's stress so naturally that she forgot it wasn't hers to hold. Aging made her realize that strength had become a performance, not a truth. She wasn't resilient, she was numb. The exhaustion wasn't physical, it was the fatigue of constantly editing herself to remain acceptable. One evening, she tried something unfamiliar. When someone asked how she was, she answered honestly. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just truthfully. The room became quiet. The conversation shifted. People didn't know what to do with her sincerity, and in that awkward silence, Laura felt something she hadn't felt in years: fear mixed with freedom. She understood that real strength is not the ability to endure everything, but the courage to admit when something hurts. And she wondered how many years she had spent proving she was fine, while slowly disappearing inside. Laura started noticing how deeply the role of the strong one had shaped the way people treated her. When she looked tired, they joked about it. When she was quiet, they assumed she needed space, not support. When she struggled, they didn't see it at all. She realized that people had learned to trust her stability so completely that any sign of vulnerability felt out of place, almost inappropriate. Even she felt uncomfortable with it. There were moments when she wanted to speak, to say that she felt empty, overwhelmed, unseen. But the words felt foreign in her mouth, like a language she had forgotten how to use. She had spent so many years being composed that chaos felt like failure. Aging made this more visible, not because her life was worse, but because she could no longer distract herself with motion. In the quiet evenings, she felt the weight of everything she had never expressed. Not dramatic pain, but small, accumulated emotional debts, unanswered needs, postponed feelings, unshared fears. She noticed how her body carried tension she never acknowledged, how even rest felt undeserved. The idea of asking for help frightened her more than being alone. She had built her identity around not needing anything, and now that identity was suffocating her.
Laura understood that her loneliness was not caused by lack of people, but by lack of permission. Permission to be imperfect, uncertain, emotionally unfinished. She had become someone others relied on, but no one truly met. And for the first time, she wondered whether the strength everyone admired was actually the reason no one ever stayed long enough to see who she really was. Laura began to feel a quiet anger toward herself. Not dramatic, not explosive, but persistent, like a low hum she couldn't turn off. She realized how often she had taught people how to treat her by never asking for anything in return. Every time she said, "It's okay," when it wasn't, every time she smiled through discomfort, she reinforced the idea that she required nothing. Over time, people stopped offering, not because they didn't care, but because she never gave them a reason to believe she needed care. Aging made this impossible to ignore. She felt emotionally undernourished, surrounded by familiarity but starving for intimacy. She thought about all the times she had listened to others for hours, held space for their pain, stayed present in moments of crisis, and how rarely anyone had done the same for her. The imbalance wasn't created by others alone. She had helped design it. That realization was painful because it removed the possibility of blame. She wasn't a victim of neglect, she was a participant in her own emotional disappearance. The hardest part was accepting that people could only meet her at the level she allowed herself to be seen. She had built walls disguised as calm, distance disguised as independence, and now she stood inside a life that looked stable from the outside, but felt hollow within. Laura understood that being strong had protected her from disappointment, but it had also protected others from ever truly knowing her. And in that awareness, she felt something close to grief, not for what she had lost, but for what she had never allowed to exist. Laura reached a point where the silence inside her became louder than any conversation around her. She noticed how easily people filled space with stories, opinions, and advice, while she carried entire emotional worlds without language. The more she observed, the clearer it became. She didn't know how to receive care, only how to give it. When someone offered help, she felt uncomfortable, suspicious, even guilty, as if support were something she hadn't earned. Aging had taught her how deeply she equated love with usefulness. If she wasn't solving a problem, listening to someone else's pain, or staying composed, she felt invisible. Rest felt like laziness. Needing felt like weakness. She had internalized a belief that her value depended on emotional labor. One evening, she imagined what it would feel like to disappear for a while, not physically, but emotionally, to stop responding first, to stop fixing, to stop being available on demand. The thought terrified her. She feared that without her constant presence, her relationships would dissolve. But beneath that fear was another truth. She was already absent from her own life. She lived in reaction mode, shaped by other people's needs, rarely checking in with her own. Laura understood that healing would not come from being needed less, but from needing herself more. The idea felt unfamiliar and fragile, like stepping onto a surface she wasn't sure could hold her. Yet for the first time, she allowed herself to consider that emotional strength might not be about endurance at all, but about allowing space for her own unmet needs to finally exist. Laura finally admitted something she had avoided for years. She didn't trust anyone to stay if she stopped being strong. That fear had shaped nearly every emotional decision she made. She believed that love was conditional, that attention had to be earned through effort, patience, and emotional control. Vulnerability felt dangerous because it introduced uncertainty, the possibility of being seen and still not being chosen. Aging made this belief harder to ignore. She noticed how often she anticipated rejection before it happened, how quickly she retreated into competence when emotions surfaced. Even in moments of connection, Part of her remained guarded, prepared to return to stability if closeness felt risky. She realized that strength had become her emotional armor, and like all armor, it protected her while also isolating her. She had trained herself to survive, not to be known. In quiet moments, she wondered who she would be without the constant need to appear composed. The answer frightened her because it was undefined. She had no emotional reference point for being held, supported, or uncertain in front of someone else. Her identity was built around not collapsing, but she was exhausted from standing. Laura understood that safety and connection were not the same thing. She was safe, stable, reliable, admired, but she was not emotionally close to anyone, including herself. And for the first time, she saw that her loneliness was not something that had happened to her. It was something she had carefully constructed in the name of survival. Laura reached a moment where pretending became more exhausting than being honest. The emotional effort required to remain composed started to feel heavier than the fear of being seen. She noticed how often she rehearsed conversations in her head, how carefully she chose words that revealed nothing real. Even her silence was controlled, shaped to appear calm rather than confused. Aging had stripped away the urgency to impress, but it had amplified the need to feel authentic. She realized that she had spent years performing stability instead of living honestly. The idea of letting someone see her uncertainty felt like standing without skin. She didn't know how to express needs without apologizing for them. She didn't know how to ask for presents without offering something in return. Her emotional language was transactional, care exchanged for usefulness, attention earned through effort. In that realization, Laura felt a quiet despair, not because she lacked relationships, but because none of them allowed her to be incomplete. She had trained the world to expect consistency and not vulnerability, and now she didn't know how to break that pattern without losing everything she had built. Yet she also understood that continuing meant slowly disappearing behind a version of herself that no longer existed. The choice was no longer between safety and risk. It was between being admired and being real. And for the first time, Laura felt ready to lose the image of strength if it meant finally being allowed to exist as she was. Laura didn't change her life in a dramatic way. There were no confrontations, no emotional speeches, no sudden reinventions. The shift was almost invisible. It began with small pauses, moments when she chose not to respond immediately, not to fix, not to smooth discomfort. She allowed silence to exist where she once rushed to fill it. She stopped apologizing for being tired. She let conversations remain unresolved. At first, people seemed confused. Some leaned in, unsure how to interact with a version of her that didn't offer constant reassurance. Others drifted away quietly, no longer certain of their role in her life. And Laura felt the loss of that familiarity, but not as pain, more as clarity. She realized that many connections had survived only because she carried their emotional weight. Without that effort, they revealed their true shape. In the quiet that followed, Laura felt something she had rarely allowed herself to feel: space. Space to notice her own moods without managing them. Space to want without explaining. Space to exist without performing strength. Aging had taught her that life does not demand constant resilience, it demands presence, and presence cannot be maintained through control. For the first time, she didn't feel responsible for how others perceived her. She didn't need to be impressive, reliable, or composed. She allowed herself to be uncertain, emotionally unfinished, and imperfect. And in that subtle freedom, Laura discovered a new kind of strength. Not the strength of endurance, but the strength of finally being honest with herself. Laura eventually understood that nothing outside of her needed to change for her life to feel different. The real shift was internal, almost imperceptible to anyone else. She stopped evaluating herself through reactions, stopped measuring her value by how useful, patient, or emotionally controlled she appeared. For most of her life, she had believed that being loved required effort, that connection had to be maintained through constant availability and self-sacrifice. But in the quiet of her new awareness, she recognized how deeply that belief had cost her. She had been present in countless moments without ever being truly seen, involved in many relationships without ever feeling met. Aging hadn't taken anything from her. It had simply removed the distractions that once kept her from noticing herself. She realized that emotional survival had shaped her more than emotional choice. Strength had not been something she possessed, it had been something she performed. And like all performances, it demanded continuous energy, attention, and control. Letting go of that role felt unfamiliar, even dangerous, but it also felt honest. She allowed herself to feel needs without justifying them, to feel sadness without correcting it, to feel tired without apologizing. She stopped translating herself into comfort for others. The world didn't collapse. People adjusted. Some stayed, some didn't. What remained was a quieter life, less crowded but more real. Laura understood that intimacy is not created through perfection, but through presence, and presence cannot exist where fear dominates. For the first time, she felt grounded in her own experience rather than defined by her role within others' lives. She was no longer the strongest person in the room, and she no longer needed to be. In releasing the identity that once protected her, she finally gave herself permission to be human, unfinished, and enough without proof.